Hello, stolen cousins. Let's get into it. We're going to do more true horror story animations, right? Let's get crazy. Why not? We're going to pick up where we left off on this video. If you don't remember, I will tag it.
I learned the hard way that if you let your guard down, it's perfect. Those were the words that came out of my mouth after I had been shown the tour of my new apartment. I was 22 at the time and I was going to college in the city. Like most big cities, finding a good apartment seemed impossible as I had been searching for months, and it wasn't till the last week of the fourth month that I found something I really liked. To be honest, I was shocked no one had snatched it up already. It had a spacious living room, a usable kitchen, enough bathrooms, and a perfect bedroom. I loved everything about it. Well, almost everything. The air in the apartment was a bit thick, and this was because of the numerous perfumed air fresheners that were situated all over the apartment. I didn't know why the place needed that many air fresheners, but
It looked
it was the
low-key
only
funky.
mandatory thing that my landlord, Mr. Terrence, asked for. My opinions on my landlord, Mr. Terrence, were pretty normal. He was an awkward but quiet guy, which was a bit weird to me as he had a really huge build, so his character didn't match his appearance. As he stood in the apartment with me, Mr. Terrence looked at me and said, "So that's it, Nathan. Remember to leave the air fresheners on every day, in addition to spray a new can in the living room every morning before you leave." He then handed me a box filled with new air fresheners.
Oh, he's killing
The
in there.
obsession with the perfume.
Yeah, he's killing. He's killing people up in there. Yep. I don't even need to know nothing else. I know that the landlord is killing people up in there.
Air fresheners was a bit weird to me, but I didn't say a word, seeing as he offered this apartment to me for a very low price.
Yeah,
To be
he's
honest,
killing.
the low price was another thing that was odd to me, as the apartment was a bit on the fancier side and it clearly cost more than that. So I was really shocked when he
'Cause he's a
immediately
killer.
agreed to let me live there for the low rent fee that I could offer. And I could recall that during our first meeting, it really seemed like he just wanted someone to live there. But I wasn't complaining because I saw it as a huge win for me, and after settling in, I slept happily that night in my new apartment. So it
I
had been a
wouldn't
couple of
trust it.
weeks since I moved into the new apartment, and while I still loved the place, I noticed a couple of strange things that were going on. For starters, I noticed that the other tenant who lived in the building actively avoided my apartment like a plague. I remember spending days wondering why they did that. At first,
Cause your
I
apartment's
thought they were just
funky.
jealous of my place. But as time went by, I realized that it wasn't jealousy. These people were truly terrified of my apartment, and the look of fear on their faces every time they crossed the hall said it all. Due to this strange behavior, the only people who visited my apartment were my friends from college. On one particular day when I was coming back home, I overheard some of the tenants talking about my place, and through the course of the conversation, I heard them call it the cursed apartment. Now, I wasn't one to believe petty gossip, but I would be lying if I said the strange rumors didn't worry me. That night, I went to bed trying to get some sleep, but I kept thinking about what I heard earlier. So in order to get more comfortable, I turned in my bed to assume a better sleeping position. But as I was turning, out of the corner of my eye, I could see the silhouette of a huge man looming over me. The terrifying sight made my heart skip as I tried my best to muffle a scream.
It's
From the
just a
slight
landlord
glimpse,
watching
I
you
could tell
sleep.
the man was a lot bigger than me, so a direct confrontation would surely end badly for me. But I also knew that lying still and pretending to sleep wasn't a smart idea, as the intruder was bound to attack sooner or later. So I planned out the last best option in my head, and I put it into action. With no hesitation, I threw my blanket towards the intruder. Stunned that I was awake, he made an attempt to grab me, but the blanket I threw at him bought me some time, and within seconds, I ran at full speed towards my bathroom. Once I was safely inside, I locked the door and called the cops, screaming. While the cops were on their way, I listened at the door to see if the intruder was making his move, but all I heard was silence. I assumed it was a play made by the intruder to make me lower my guard, so I stayed in the bathroom till the cops arrived. When the
Probably
cops
left.
arrived, they searched the apartment before letting me out of the bathroom. I was then asked a couple of questions, and I told them everything they needed to know. But after looking around and carrying out a small investigation, the cops began to doubt my claim as the head officer asked me, "Are you sure you saw someone in here? Because from the look of things, it really seems like no one apart from you was here."
No,
Confused, I
someone's up
said,
in there.
"But I'm sure I saw someone watching me while I was sleeping. He
The
also
landlord.
attempted to attack me." The officer then looked at me and said, "Well, we checked the door and there was no signs of breaking and entering." Baffled at his
Because he got
statement,
keys.
I didn't know what else to say. As if there weren't any signs of breaking in, I didn't have any proof apart from my word. The officer saw I was having a hard time making sense of things, so he said, "Look, kid, I know you are confused right now, but I heard it's finals week, so maybe the pressures of the exam is getting to you and making you see things.
No.
Trust me, college finals can do that to a man." The other officers laughed at his joke, but I didn't. I was still in shock, and I wasn't in the mood to laugh. The cops left after
Exactly,
a while,
'cause ain't
and they
shit
told me
funny.
to be sure that there was someone before I called the next time. The week that followed after that incident was horrible, as I couldn't sleep well and I was jumping at the sound of every little thing. Soon the rumors of the apartment being cursed started to seem true to me, and I eventually couldn't take it anymore. So the next day, I went across the hall and begged my neighbor, Old Lady Grace, to tell me why my apartment was the subject of many rumors and if those rumors were true. When we had settled in her apartment, she told me a morbid tale about how, for the past 12 years, all 8 tenants who have lived in my apartment had mysteriously disappeared. She said that back-to-back disappearances had caused quite a stir in the neighborhood, and people started getting anxious. But even with all the tension, it was only the people who lived in my apartment who went missing. She then said the cops had opened up numerous missing persons cases due to the rising number of grieving families, but the bodies of all 8 tenants were never found. She then added that Mr. Terrence, my landlord, was always questioned after every one of his tenants had gone missing, but he always proved he had nothing to do with it, and he always walked free. As she spoke about Mr. Terrence, I noticed she had a bit of anger in her voice, so I asked, "Hey, I know this is a bit forward, Miss Grace, but do you have anything against my landlord, Terrence?" The old woman then looked at me and said, "No, I have no problems with him, but there's something about that man. You're young, so you won't understand, but I can see things, and something isn't right with him." Her words struck me as I left her apartment. I told myself that I really didn't.
I got an old soul, I've been told, so I can see it too. Creepy ass. He's killing folks. He's snatching y'all up and killing them. He probably got like a pathway from y'all house to his. Yeah, he's killing y'all.
Find
I'm
anything
sure of
wrong
it.
with my landlord, Terrence. Apart from the incessant use of air fresheners, he seemed like a nice man, but even then, I wasn't going to take any chances. That night, I stayed up doing research on the cases, and I found out everything that Old Lady Grace said was true. So I made up my mind to move. I started making preparations to move the next day. I managed to get a place to stay as one of my friends allowed me to stay with him until I found another place. To avoid any problems, I decided not to tell Mr. Terrence that I was moving till the next morning when I was ready to leave. I can't really remember, but I'm guessing it was due to the abrupt moving process, as I forgot to put on or spray the air fresheners that morning. I spent the whole day at my friend's house, setting up my things, and after a long day's work, I went back home knowing it'd be the last night I'd spend in the strange apartment. But when I got home, a truly morbid and rancid smell filled my nostrils. It was so bad that I found it hard to breathe. I rushed to open a window or get a can of air fresheners when the words, "So I heard you're moving," made me freeze. I slowly turned around to see who said the sentence, and standing there in the dark was my landlord, Mr. Terrence. Fear filled me as I started to stutter the words. What are you doing here, Mr. Terrence?" Totally ignoring my question, he said, "Why didn't you tell me you were moving? Were you just going to leave?" I then slowly answered him with, "I was going to tell you in the morning, Mr. Terrence." My landlord then looked at me and said, "Why are you leaving? Because of some false rumors that you heard? You'd be a fool to give up this apartment after I basically let you live here for a non-existent price." It was dark, and I couldn't see Mr. Terrence's face, but I could hear the rising anger in his voice, so I said, "You're scaring me now, Mr. Terrence, and I think you need to leave." He ignored my statement again before proceeding to say something that I wasn't expecting. As Terrence looked at me, dead in the eyes, he said in a calm voice, "Do you collect anything, Nathan?" Stunned at the totally irrelevant question, I didn't know what to say. But before I
He
could answer
collects
the
people.
question, he said, "Well, I do. You
I
see,
knew it.
Nathan, I collect these things called human beings. To be honest, I currently have 8 in my collection, and I'm looking to increase that number to 9 by the end of this night." It took me a while for my mind to register the horrifying statement that
How
my
did it take
landlord
you
had just
time
made.
to
But
register?
before I could react, he lunged at me with his fist in the air.
Oh!
Within seconds, he was in front of me, but I managed to dodge the dangerous punch.
Oh!
His hand went through the drywall, and the wall pieces went flying through the air.
Oh!
He pulled
He's
his
trying
head
to
out of the
beat
wall,
your
and
ass!
for a split second, everything clicked as I had a horrible realization about Mr. Terrence's collectibles.
I told you.
It was dark, but there was no mistaking it.
Ew!
Staring right at me was a rotting corpse situated in the wall of my apartment. My
I
mind
told
started
you. I knew
unraveling
it.
at the ghastly sight, but I didn't stop because I knew if I didn't do something quickly,
He was gonna knock
I
your
would
head
soon
off.
join his collection inside the walls. Mr. Terrence was free now, and as he saw my pale face, he said, "I see you've seen where I keep my wonderful collectibles. Don't worry, you'll soon make a fine addition." I rushed for the door, but I wasn't quick enough as he managed to tackle me into a table. The contents of the table spilled over as we fell to the floor struggling. I fought back with all of my strength, but it was hopeless as he was 2 times bigger than me. And it didn't take long before he had his arms wrapped around my neck. I don't know if you've ever been strangled before, but
No.
there aren't enough words to describe how painful it is. I couldn't breathe as I felt him put his whole weight down on my neck. I gasped for air as the world around me began to dim. I thrashed and struggled to look for something, anything that I could use to defend myself. And I was about to give up before I felt it. One of my hands thrashing had managed to get a hold of an air freshener can.
Those
It
things
must
be
have
hard.
been one of the cans that fell when we collided into the table. I knew the can wasn't strong enough to knock him out, so I decided to temporarily blind him.
Period.
With no hesitation, I picked up the can and sprayed it in his eyes. He screamed and reached for his eyes as he finally let go of my neck.
Go!
I then struck his head with the can before rushing to the door, and as I opened it, I ran into the arms of numerous cops that had just arrived. I would later find out Old Lady Grace had heard the noises from my apartment, so she called the cops. I don't know if it was from the fighting or the fear, but I passed out there, happy that I had survived the cursed apartment. After
Definitely
that
both.
incident, numerous things surrounding the apartment were revealed. Mr. Terrence was arrested, and after his apartment was searched and tore down, over 8 badly preserved corpses were found in the walls, and each and every one of them was identified as the bodies of his former tenants. After interrogations, Mr. Terrence also confessed to watching his tenants, potential victims, when they slept.
Told
He
you.
also went into details about how he got the preserved bodies into the walls, as he said he managed to do it all under the ruse of remodeling the apartment. He then finally confessed to keeping a spare key to the apartment, a key that was unknown to his residents. The families of the victims called for him to be put to death, but he was instead sentenced to life imprisonment. After the whole case had been settled, I moved back to the suburbs with my family. I didn't finish college as I was told I needed time to heal from the traumatizing event. Even after all this time, the therapy still doesn't work, as there's nothing anyone can tell me to make me get over the fact that I slept in a room filled with 8 corpses for over 4 months. But on the bright side,
Damn.
I left the morbid experience with a lesson, as I realized that it's not only people that have stories. Places, too, always have a tale to tell, and those tales should be important to anyone who is deciding to live or stay in those places, because the knowledge of those tales may one day save or end your life.
I always suggest finding out where you're moving to. Like, you can't really do that with apartments, I don't necessarily think, but definitely with like houses and, houses. Definitely find out about your property because you don't want to move into somewhere where you don't know nothing about, and like that kid, there's bodies in there. Like, that's just crazy. So please, please, please find out. If your landlord is trying to give you something as at too cheap of a price, it's either going to be a shitty home, shitty meaning like it's going to be falling apart, or he's not going to know how to do repairs, or, it's going to take him forever to come and do the repairs, you know, or simply shitty and cheap because it's haunted or multiple people died there, so please be aware. Please find out what's going on with your place
This
before
story of
just moving
mine
up in
comes
there.
from perhaps the worst period.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
This story of mine comes from perhaps the worst period of my entire life so far. I grew up privileged. Summers in the Hamptons and winters in the Bahamas kind of privileged. My dad was an investment banker, and a good one at that. So much so that Mom never had to work after they got married. I had it all. Fancy private schooling bled into what I thought would be a free college education. Well, not exactly free since Dad was footing the bill, but I'd never be saddled with any kind of crippling student debt that would turn my peers into wage slaves for the rest of their lives. At least, that's what I thought was going to happen, until the 2008 financial crash. A lot of other financial companies got government bailouts, right out of the taxpayer's pocket, but my dad's didn't. For whatever reason, they didn't qualify, so he lost his job. Long story short, one day I was in college, living the good life. The next I was on the phone to my mom, being told I'd have to drop out and find a job if I ever wanted to be able to support myself, as they just didn't have the spare cash anymore. It was devastating. I'd never worked a day in my life before, and there I was, traipsing around town with a folder full of resumes, trying to find something, anything, to get some cash in my account. And that's how I ended up working at Burger King. It was really hard at first. Although I didn't necessarily feel like it, I obviously gave off some major rich girl vibes, as the rough, tough, working-class staff members detected it immediately. They didn't go easy on me, not in the slightest. But if I'm honest, that's the best thing that could have happened to me. In the space of about 3 months, I learned the meaning of a hard day's work, and the more I threw myself into the challenge of full-time work, the more my colleagues started to respect and appreciate me. In the end, we were incredibly tight, and I still keep in touch with a few of them via Facebook and stuff, but anyway, now that you have a bit of background, on with the story. So I was working the late shift one night, which is generally the hardest shift of the day. The manager only ever put the most competent, most capable workers on that shift, and I know it sounds dumb, but the fact that I'd proven myself enough to be put on that cycle was a huge compliment to me. We used to stay open until midnight on weekends, and at about 11:30, we get this pretty regular-looking dude.
If you see me cheese a little extra, it's because I've worked fast food. I worked both Burger King and McDonald's. Before, I worked at McDonald's first, and then I worked at Burger King a few years later. I worked at McDonald's overnight, and then I worked closing at Burger King. And if it's really, it doesn't take. I'm sorry. It's not like it doesn't take dedication for you to be at the overnight and the closing positions for those jobs. You have to be above 18, and you have to be willing. You have to have nothing. You have to be willing. Not everybody's willing to work overnights. They have something else to do. Not everybody is willing to work until closing. Like he said, it closes at 12 o'clock sometimes. Burger King, a lot of places. A lot of McDonald's are overnights, So just think, and in order to work overnight, you have to be an adult. So all you have to do is just be 18. And if you want to make a little bit more money, because they pay overnight workers and closing people more because you're closing and you're working overnight. Not to knock anything, because it definitely made me feel good hearing, that his manager told him that. So my manager was probably like, all right, yeah, she needs to be here closing because she's one of the best workers. And I was like, yeah.
Coming in, standing there at the counter whilst perusing the menu behind me. I gave it my best. May I take your order, sir? He looks down at me. Without skipping a beat, he's like, 2 double cheeseburgers, please. I could have plugged the order into the register when he interrupts me with an addendum into his order. Could I have those without the bun, the bacon, or any cheese, and hold off on grilling them for me, would you? Thanks. I stopped plugging his order in and looked up at him. Excuse me? It took a moment for me to really process what he was asking for.
That he asked for 2 raw
and he
burgers.
smiled as he began to clarify what his order was. Is there a problem? Yeah. I'm not sure we're allowed to serve raw hamburgers. It's against food safety regulations. You've heard of steak tartare, haven't you? Yet another guy who immediately detected something in my mannerisms or accent that suggested I was upper class. I didn't even justify it with a response. I just asked him to wait a second while I talked to my supervisor. So the supervisor comes out and basically tells the guy no, just like I had. Even if you can eat raw beef, it's just not something we're able to serve our customers, or that's what I thought anyway. Because as my super is talking to this guy, calmly explaining that as much as he's sorry, it's just not something we can do, the guy rolls his eyes and pulls out a wad of high-denomination bills from his pocket and is just like, how much would it take? Now the place is pretty much empty at this point, but all eyes are on this guy and his wad of bills. I'll never forget the moment my supervisor stopped talking all calm and professional before turning to me and telling me, go to the back and clean something. I was stunned. I knew the guy well enough to know exactly what he was doing. He was going to clear the floor of potential witnesses, then actually get this guy's order. I pretended to clean something, all the while spying on him as he collected 2 raw patties from the fridge and sort of went through the motions of cooking them, so that if anyone watched the cameras back, it would look like he had done his job to the letter. A couple of minutes later, he comes into the back, telling me to take over the register, but not before he slides a few crisp $100 bills into my hand, telling me not to say a word to anyone and to just forget about what had happened before people.
If you're not looking to be anywhere long term forever, then I say go ahead. If you have all of the morals in the world, then obviously you're not going to. But it's I don't know. My mind would have instantly jumped to why didn't you just go to a grocery store and get raw burgers? I don't know. It's just me. Would I have done it? Possibly. Because he said, how much money do you have in your pocket? How much money more can you get? Because I'm about to lose my job for giving you 2 raw burgers. And after asking how much, what's your limitations on me? How much is it going to take? I'm an expensive gal. Hopefully he got more than a couple grand. Because when I was working at McDonald's and Burger King, my rent was $800. Now it's double that, So I would have definitely, getting 2-3 grand then is definitely a few months rent. And then you can find another job by then. But, I don't know. I'm expensive. You want to ask me how much would it take? I'm definitely going to say a ton of money. I just can't help it. I'm sorry. It's just me.
People start running their mouths about it. As far as the rest of the team knew, he had told the guy no, served him some regular burgers, then simply gone about the rest of his shift as normal. But I couldn't let it go. I had to get some closure, even if I had a few $100 worth of tips. I had to know what this guy's deal was. So being the sly fox that I am, I ducked my supervisor and hit up the manager in his office, asking him if, since it's so quiet, it'd be okay if I took a cigarette break. He looks at me all confused, turning in his chair before saying, you don't smoke, do you? Yeah, I just started. Stresses of the job. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but you're entitled to your 5 minutes. Just make sure you get your station covered. So I did. I got a buddy of mine to man the register, bummed the smoke off of one of the fryer guys, then stood out back trying to get a look at the guy as he headed for his car. So there's me, standing there, pretending to smoke while I pretend I'm not watching this dude climbing into his driver's side. Then the thought hits me. It's late. Stores might not be open. In fact, they definitely weren't open, and the dude probably wanted something to cook with, right? Wrong. I distinctly see him unwrap the dripping wet burger wrapper before he raised the raw meat to his face. He doesn't take a bite, not like I expected him to. In fact, it looks more like he's smelling the meat more than anything else. I really couldn't believe what I was seeing. Literally, though, I thought the perspective had me seeing something that I wasn't, so I made the awful decision to edge a little closer to the car, angling out so I could see through the driver's side window.
Nosy.
All without considering that his side mirror would reveal me as the peeper that I was. And oh my God, the way he looked at me through that window, this wild look in his eyes after breaking from what looked so much like he was making out with that chunk of meat. He was furious, gunning his engine before ripping out of the parking lot as fast as he could move. I just tossed the cigarette, ran back inside, and went straight to the super to tell him what I'd seen. He only repeated that no matter what, I wasn't to tell a soul that we'd served him raw meat, or those few $100 bills would be the last money we ever got out of this place if the owner didn't opt to sue us too. We never saw that guy ever again, and no one ever found out about the raw meat we sold him.
We all know now.
I don't suppose I was in any real danger, but it was definitely the scariest, if not the most disturbing incident I've ever had while working at Burger King. I grew up an avid urbex enthusiast here in New York City. As you can imagine, there are awesome sights here, but weirdly, I'd say more than 50% of the community agree that one of the urbex holy grails is over in Cincinnati. Yep, while Cincinnati is famous for that weird Greek chili or their OG baseball team, among the urbex crowd it's famous for one thing: the Cincinnati subway. For those of you that don't know, the subway was intended as a replacement for the Cincinnati streetcar system. Construction started around the end of World War I, but then after the Great Depression hit, the project just tanked. What remains is just over 2 miles of derelict tunnels and stations, making it the largest abandoned subway system in the United States. Cracking the place is like an urbex rite of passage, giving you infinite bragging rights having explored a labyrinth of subterranean tunnels that's larger than some towns. I thought my visit to the subway would be a dream come true. Me and my group planned it for months, and I don't think I've ever been so excited about anything. But in reality, it turned out to be one of the most confusing and terrifying experiences of my life, something I'll never be able to fully explain. As I said, it took quite a bit of planning to get the 4 of us out to southwestern Ohio. On top of barely being able to afford the gas money, we had to drive my friend's trashy 1990 Chevy Lumina, which was in such a bad way that it had become a meme of itself. It took almost 12 hours to get to Cincinnati. That's including a bathroom break, so even after leaving at like 9 a.m., the very earliest we could muster everyone, it was way after dark by the time we arrived. We were tired, starving, and in no mood to head underground right away, so after a brief discussion, we decided to get a few hours sleep before heading down into the subway. This turned out to be a terrible idea. We barely got any sleep, so after a few hours we decided to just get some breakfast at a 24/7 McDonald's, then hit up the subway while we could still use the darkness for cover. The entrance to the tunnels, at least the one we used, turned out to be right in plain sight. It was just sat at the side of a highway, clear as day, and although the big gray iron doors were incredibly heavy, they proved to be unlocked. And just like that, we were in. Then, one of us switched on their flashlight, and for a second, I was kind of taken aback. The concrete walls inside the entrance were completely bare, not a single tag or piece of graffiti art anywhere. One of the best parts of urbex is occasionally stumbling across what amounts to a secret gallery. So, To come across a place with no art where I expected at most was kind of disappointing. It didn't set alarm bells ringing or whatever, it was just unusual. Anyway, we excitedly started advancing down the entrance tunnel and find that it branched off into 2 twin tunnels that ran side by side. Then, after a few minutes of walking, the tunnels opened up into our first abandoned station. You can imagine what this looked like. Wide platforms with support columns, staircases that led to nowhere. It was a pretty cool find, and it was there that we found our first piece of street art. Only, instead of being something to admire, I remember finding it distinctly intimidating. Someone had sprayed a huge black figure onto the whole length of one wall, with its head and shoulders kind of overflowing onto the ceiling. The perspective made it look like it was staring down at you.
I've always wondered with like street art and stuff, like, you know, like how they got up there. You know? Like, I understand like using ladders and all that other stuff, you know, but like that's, you know, like that's abandoned. So like you brought a ladder all the way through some, you know, abandoned tunnels just to, you know, free your artistic mind. And obviously, you know, that could have happened, but like I'm just like, dang.
And
It's
it
just
definitely
crazy
made
to
for an
me.
intelligent and decidedly creepy piece of artwork. The logistics of it were downright impressive too. The walls had to be at least 15 foot high at the platform level, meaning someone had probably hauled a ladder down there with him at some point just to
You see,
spray
that's what I
that
said.
blank-faced Yeti-looking thing on the wall. After we were suitably unnerved by the big dark figure, we carried on through the rail tunnels, hitting up station after station as we went. Each one had a series of smaller tunnels leading off from them. Some were just a handful of dead ends. Others seemed to snake off into the darkness for quite a way. But the last station we got to, or at least that I got to, had a ton of different passages leading off from it. I'm guessing we were around the center of the subway system by that point because I read that they'd planned to dig out the central terminal station first, then tunnel outwards so everything fit to scale. And given that there seemed to be a tunnel, passageway, or corridor at every compass point, I'm guessing we were in that terminal station. Despite the creepy street art, we're getting pretty comfortable by that point. The first 10 to 15 minutes after you crack an old abandoned building can be a real adrenaline rush, and if there are hazards to be aware of, your heart stays pounding almost the whole way through. By that time, our count was in the high 50s, and I go so far as to say that we were pretty experienced. But that experience brings comfort, and getting too comfortable makes you sloppy. Add on to that a bad night's sleep and the sugar crash from having gorged under the golden arches, and for me personally, it was a recipe for disaster. It's not a strict life or death rule, but generally speaking, you don't split up when exploring an abandoned building. Sure, you can head off into an adjacent room, dip slightly out of sight for a second, but you don't go off wandering on your own, not unless you're very, very confident of your surroundings. You hear horror stories about gas sinks where someone walks into a room and just passes out and dies, all totally silently. Then one by one, their friends follow them into the room, only to join them in death. Little tidbits like that serve as great warnings, but gas sinks are an extremely rare phenomenon that you only get when you're really deep underground. So despite the potential for danger, I think I just switched off a few seconds and wandered down a passageway on my own. It was dumb, I know, but I swear I didn't
Like, why
walk
would
too
you
far.
do that after
I remember the
saying
feeling of
that you're not
confusion
supposed
when I
to?
turned around and walked back down the corridor, only to find that it didn't open back up into the abandoned station. I stopped and paused for a second, feeling this momentary sense of bewilderment wash over me before I took a deep breath and gathered my thoughts. My crew had to be at the end of the corridor I was looking at. It was only logical. But when I walked down it, still using my flashlight to cut through the darkness, and there was still no station, I'll admit that I started to panic a little. My voice echoes
A
as I
little?
called out down the corridor, hoping my friends might be able to hear me. When they didn't respond, I did what anyone else might do. Just went straight into denial. I called out sarcastically, "Very funny, guys. You can come out now." But no one replied. Then I tried to stop myself from walking down another corridor, but in that brief little moment of panic, I just couldn't help myself. It didn't make sense. I knew how to follow my own footsteps. I'd done it 1,000 times before. But there I was, 50-something derps under my belt, and I'd actually gone and gotten myself lost. I just put it down to how tired I was and how dark the subway was, then reached in my backpack to retrieve my walkie-talkie. We always pack these small things, but powerful radios just in case. We never really had to use them before, but there's a first time for everything, right? So, I got the radio out, switched it on, then began talking on the agreed-upon Channel 1. Our little pre-agreed protocol was that as soon as someone gets separated, out come the radios. The guys must have figured I was missing by that point, so they must have had their radios out, or at least one of them. But when I talked onto the channel and got nothing in reply, I went back to thinking that they were just playing a prank on me. Then suddenly, my radio buzzes to life with an incoming transmission. It sounded kind of distorted, but that didn't surprise me given that we were surrounded by masses of concrete. But as I'm straining my ears to listen to voices in the static, I realize it's not any of my buddies' voices. In fact, it sounded a lot more like a woman. It was slightly accented, a feminine voice, but I could only make out every fourth or fifth word. Everything else was just garbled. Yet as I strained my ears and concentrated, I heard the voice repeating something that sounded an awful lot like, "Help me." That was the first time I'd ever come to a full-on panic while in an abandoned building, and I had to actually make an effort to control my breathing and keep calm. I told myself that the "help me" I thought I heard could have been almost any two-syllable phrase, and rationally speaking, the subway was a limited space. Even if I'd managed to get myself lost, there was no way I could stay lost if I just kept moving. So, that's exactly what I did. I switched on my little headlamp, told myself everything was going to be fine, then just walked off into the darkness. My main goal was to find the station we'd been standing in. That way I could effectively retrace my steps and find my way out of the subway system. But I walked and walked for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and the whole time I failed to find an abandoned station, or even any of the twin railway tunnels we'd used to get into the place. It was just corridor after corridor, some of which forked off into 2 or 3 other passageways, and no matter which one I took, I never seemed to make any progress. I knew I could walk a mile in around 15 minutes, which meant that I could walk the entire length of the subway system in around 30 to 40. So when I clocked 45 minutes of walking, and I still hadn't found an exit, I felt myself getting that feeling of panic rising up into my chest again. It just didn't make any sense. The whole way I'd been talking to my radio, trying to raise my buddies, but to no avail. They had to be in range. Those radios were some of the most expensive things we owned, and the only reasonable explanation is the concrete was just too thick for the radio waves to penetrate. But still, even with a semi-rational explanation like that, I found one distinct thought creeping into my head. Something is very, very wrong here. Either something was wrong with me, or something was wrong with the tunnels, and being a somewhat rational person, I went with the first theory. I remember having to turn back when I wound up hitting a dead end, but after a few hundred feet, I realized I was walking a different layout of corridors than I had previously. Some of them had these cuboid concrete bumps in them, like they were the foundations for some kind of barrier. But then I started seeing them on the ceiling too, these 3D rectangles that look like they've been chiseled out of the rock.
Haunted?
I hadn't seen those things walking down the corridor the first time, at least. I hadn't noticed them, but then my suspicions were confirmed when I noticed that the concrete ahead of me was all wet, something which definitely hadn't been the case a few minutes before. That little detail did really bother me, way worse than losing my buddies too. As you can probably guess, underground tunnels and water leaks are a very bad combination, and the discovery added an even graver sense of danger to the situation. After I noticed the water, my pace increased significantly as I tried my best to keep calm, but the further I went, the harder that got. The sound of my wet footsteps had me praying I wasn't heading towards the source of the leak, and that I wasn't about to get hit by some underground tsunami or something. Not the most rational fear, I know, but like I said, I was struggling to remain calm. But then, right as the tension was really ramping up, I could have sworn that I'd heard a second set of wet footsteps in the tunnel behind me. I remember stopping dead in my tracks and listening, but the sound didn't continue, so I figured it was just an echo of my own footsteps.
No.
Yet shortly after continuing on my way, I heard a footstep behind me that was most definitely not in rhythm with my own. Again, I stop. Only that time I spin around on the spot, shining my flashlight into the darkness. I didn't see anything, and the sound of footsteps didn't continue, but I started to get this horrible feeling that there was something just out of range of my flashlight. That then queued up all these questions like, who's down here without a flashlight, and who might follow me and not announce themselves? The Cincinnati PD had been known to patrol the tunnels and kick out any homeless trying to sleep there, and the Urbex crowd tend to hate cops and security guards, but I found myself in this weird position where I actually hoped it was a cop that was following me, and not someone else. I tried to just push on, but turning around every so often when I thought I heard footsteps began to slow me down. And then I began to hit other obstacles. Those same cubes of concrete I'd seen previously, only they were much larger. Some of them were so big I had to actually step up onto them to get past. It made no sense why they were there either, like they only seemed to serve the purpose of constructing the tunnel. After another few hundred yards, the beam of my flashlight began to illuminate something that just sent my stomach into knots. For absolutely no reason I could discern, the tunnel abruptly narrowed to the point that there was only a very small vertical gap that I'd have to push myself a couple of feet through to keep going. I actually just stood there for a second and said out loud, "You have to be kidding me." The only other thing was the worry that the gap would somehow narrow even further, and that I might get stuck trying to get through. But right as I'm mulling that thought over, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Only that time, there was no mistaking it. It couldn't have been the echo of my own. There was definitely someone else in that tunnel with me. I called out to them. Wishful thinking, I suppose, and when the speed of the footsteps dramatically increased, I knew their intentions toward me were not good. Fight or flight kicked in, and in the moment, I chose flight, shoving myself shoulder first into the narrow opening in the concrete before grinding my way through. The whole time I expected to feel a hand grabbing at my back, and when I finally popped out of the other side, I spun around and shone my flashlight to see who in God's name was chasing me. But there was no one. I knew they were there, though, hiding off just to the side, maybe just waiting for me to let my guard down before pushing through after me. Needless to say, I didn't wait to find out if I was right. I just took off along the wet concrete, trying to put as much distance between myself and my pursuer as possible. As I ran, I started to notice a lot more of those weird cuboid structures, only this time some of them were triangular, like little pyramids coming out of the walls, floor, and ceiling. The others had at least looked like they served some kind of purpose, but these new things looked almost completely random, like they were a glitch in a video game's levels or something. I'd have taken more time to observe them if I hadn't been running for my life. Only after a few hundred yards or so, the tunnel narrowed off yet again. Only that time, it was like nothing I'd ever seen in my entire life. Now that I think back on it, it was like looking at a piece of tessellated art, like the kind that uses different sizes of the same shape to create a kind of 3D optical illusion. It would have been fascinating if I hadn't been forced to crawl through it on my stomach, not knowing if I was going to get trapped and starve to death in there. The whole lining of the passageway was ridged with tiny versions of the same pyramid structures, and it was so narrow that I had to take off my backpack and shove it in front of me in order to fit through. The little ridges raked at my back the whole way, but my adrenaline was pumping so hard that I could feel the damage it was doing. It just didn't hurt. And then came the moment where I couldn't advance any further. I could feel the little ridges against my skull, neck, and shoulders. I couldn't push my backpack any further, and I was actually stuck. I was so scared I felt sick, and I'm not ashamed to say I felt the overwhelming urge to burst into tears.
I would have been
My
crying.
mom had always told me that I'd eventually get myself hurt if I persisted with the trespassing nonsense, and in that moment, it seemed like she'd been proven right. Only the thing that made me want to burst into tears was the fact that she might never find out how right she was. I'd never be found because I knew I was somewhere I wouldn't be found just by looking for it. I know that must make no sense, but in that moment, trapped in the bizarre, intricately chiseled crawl space, it made all the sense of the world. And just as it was sinking in just how screwed I really was, I heard something moving through the tunnels behind me. I'm not even sure how this really happened because as much as I tried to force my way through the crawl space, I simply could not go any further. But hearing that person and what I'm assuming was a person moving up behind me,
It's a demon.
it just sent me into overdrive. I just kept focusing on kicking my legs, wiggling my torso, and pushing my backpack in front of me that I barely even realized I'd shoved it out the other side. Then once I could get a grip of the opening, I let out all the air in my lungs to be able to fit through, and pulling with all my might. Feeling myself free of the crawl space concrete grip was the second time that night that I almost cried. But there was no time to celebrate. I had to keep moving. Only right when I needed it the most, right when I thought I was about to lose my mind with fear, my flashlight started to flicker. I'd replaced the batteries that night in preparation for exploring the subway. There was no way I could have been down there long enough to drain them. And I just lost it, consumed by panic, and I sprinted down the corridor, trying to make as much progress as possible before the flashlight gave out entirely. It started to flicker again, and I was running. I actually started calling out, "Mom, Mom," like she could somehow save me from a nightmarish fate.
My mom would have.
Then I tripped, and I hit the dirt hard. I felt the sting of the grazes on my forearms mix with my sweat, and there was this dull ringing in my ear that I first figured was from being knocked unconscious. But the monotonous ringing wasn't anything in my head. It was from a nearby highway. And when I opened my eyes, I saw I was back outside. I have absolutely no idea how I got back outside after tripping in the darkness. When I stopped ugly weeping into the dirt, I looked around for the entrance I'd fallen out of, but I couldn't see anything. Then right as I'm trying to work out what in God's name just happened to me, I feel my phone buzzing in my pocket as it reconnected to the cell network.
It's your mom.
And I won't bore you with the whole aftermath. I feel like this whole thing is just a massive wall of text already, but the looks on my friends' faces on the ride back as I tried to explain what happened.
As long as your friends are out too.
Well, they put me off ever trying to properly explain it to someone. I went to therapy for a few years after a psychiatrist diagnosed me as having experienced a stress-induced psychotic break. I tried to accept that what happened was all just in my head, but honestly, I know that isn't entirely the case. And for some reason, whenever my mind wanders back to that night, I think of that giant black figure someone had spray painted on the wall. At the time, I had no idea why anyone would spend so much time on something that no one might ever see. But now, I think I understand.
I would have been crying. I would have been dead. I would have been. I would have been so overwhelmed. I promise you, I would have been so
I apologize in
overwhelmed.
advance for not being the best storyteller, but this is definitely a true story. It's also not my story as much as it is my mom's, who used to work at a motel in California back in the 80s. Anyways, one day a guy shows up to book a room, and I'm just going to refer to this guy as the guest, since I don't actually know his name. My mom got assigned to clean his room on the daily, but as time went by, she noticed that he always had the Do Not Disturb sign up on his room. So even like a week into his stay, she never once had a chance to clean his room.
So just leave him alone.
This didn't bother the cleaning staff too much, because the way my mom tells it, the guy was always super nice and friendly whenever he passed reception or bumped into any of the cleaning staff, always apologizing and telling them that he'd just clean up after himself. So if it saved them some work, they weren't exactly going to complain about it. Anyways, there came a point where the guy wasn't seen for a few days, and the Do Not Disturb sign wasn't on the door anymore, so everyone figured that he just checked out and they'd be able to clean the room again. So given that my mom had been assigned to the room like a month before, it came down to her to head over to clean it. As she got to the floor and unlocked the door to the room, a disturbing smell hit her. She couldn't figure out what it was, but she continued to survey the room, which, contrary to the guest's previous assurances, was disgustingly messy. Her words were that it looked like someone had thrown a party, even though everyone was pretty sure that no one else seemed to have ever gone into the room besides the guest. Anyways, my mom was still shocked by the smell, so she tried to track it down. Then as she followed the smell, she could tell it was coming from the hotel room closet. When she opened the closet, there was nothing but a wet-looking cardboard box on the ground. And my mom said the smell got way more intense, so she could tell it was coming from there. She said she had a strong suspicion that the guests had been using it to go to the bathroom in, so the last thing she wanted to do was look inside it. Instead, she puts on some gloves and covers up her mouth and nose, then picks the thing up to throw it into the trash. That's when she felt how heavy it was, like way heavier than if there was just some feces inside it or something.
No, that's
it was
a body.
Only when one of the other cleaning ladies smelled the same smell that they straight up said, "Somebody call the cops."
She knows it's a body.
A few years before, this same cleaning lady had found a dead body in a room, as someone had a heart attack with a Do Not Disturb sign on the door, and it took almost 2 weeks before they finally went to investigate. She said it was like the exact same kind of rotting smell. Definitely not anything else from the human body, so they called the cops so they could come take a look at it. The cops showed up, cut open the box with everyone watching. Then the officer just looked up to his partner with this numb expression saying, "Call the coroner. We're going to 419. Someone had to explain to my mom that the number was police code for dead body. Only it wasn't like a whole body in there. That much was obvious because the box was too small. It turned out to be just a decapitated head. I don't really know many more details than that. This is almost 40 years ago now, and I couldn't find any internet archive stuff before I wrote this up, but my mom said that there was talk of the head belonging to a call girl who had gone missing a few weeks before. They gave all the guy's info to the cops, but apparently that didn't help. The credit card was stolen, and the guy had used the name on that card. Imagine being that person whose credit card got stolen, though. One day you think you've lost it or something, and then the next, the cops show up accusing you of having murdered a girl. Mom stayed working at the motel for maybe like a year afterward, and she only quit when she met my dad and moved into his place up in Vallejo. That story always kept me from ever wanting to work in a hotel or motel or anything like that, and no matter how desperate for money I get, I think I'd have to be very, very desperate to work anywhere you might see the darker side of human nature.
This happened to me.
Sounds crazy. But I'm ended there. 4 stories. Whew. Seems to be taking me out. Thank you, Stolen Cousins, for sitting with me watching these little crazy little horror stories. Yeah, these ones are definitely more like, realistic, not so like spooky in your face type things. I don't know. I still enjoy them. I just like horror stories regardless. So If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe, because why not? If you subscribe, then obviously we're stolen cousins, and support your cousin. Support's free. So why not support your cousin, you know? Thank you and have a great day. Bye.